Thank you, Janet. I was once on a bus to Philadelphia to visit KP, and that, of course, led me to grapple with the idea of a postmodern society and suffering. Suffering. A word that I think many of us might struggle with as to what it means, why it happens in an era of TED Talks and podcasts that I consume voraciously, that I love to listen to and think about. In an era of life hacks and Amazon Prime and encouragement to work smarter and not harder, to work to eliminate any and all kind of suffering in our lives. If you achieve the American dream and you get enough money, everything will be taken care of for you. And I began to wonder if, in fact, suffering can be good. So stick with me here, because that has a certain connotation. So this is not coming from a Christian misinterpretation of Holy Scriptures that say suffering is a necessity for your soul to be saved. It's not about purifying your human condition. That's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is that I think suffering maybe not has a purpose, but I think it's part of our purpose. It's not that suffering itself is good or bad on its own. But I think the fact that we can suffer and that we do suffer and that suffering, according to the Buddhist tradition, right, is inevitable, that life is suffering, I actually think that's the good news. Stay with me. I can feel you slipping. Stay with me. As we know, many of our siblings who practice the Buddhist tradition, they know that the wheel of suffering is the cycle of life, that suffering is life. And if this is news to you, take a moment, take a breath. That can be a lot. But it's not that life is only suffering, right? There are good things in life too. There are things that bring joy and bring peace. For me, that is bowling alley nachos. That is churros at the state fair. That is the first sign of bluebonnets in the spring where I come from. That is the joy that animals bring to my life. It's the joy that children bring to my life. And when I contrast that with suffering, I get kind of a disconnect. Because I have been taught to not suffer, or that I'm not supposed to suffer, or at least taught to not suffer well, perhaps. Cowboys don't cry, as my granddad used to say. I was taught that you're supposed to apologize for crying at funerals. Y'all, how wild is that? That we apologize for crying at funerals. In the saddest days of our lives, we feel like we're not supposed to express this emotion. As my granddad would say, that is what he called bass-ackwards. Because we don't do suffering well in this culture. In my culture, in American culture, white American culture, white American male culture. We don't do suffering well. And I wonder if we don't do suffering well because we lack a real good theology to explain it. If the theology that we got is that suffering is somehow necessary for our salvation or our liberation, that's a hard pill to swallow. And for those of us who are UUs, have given up on an idea of God, the reality of suffering presents a lot of problems. Why does suffering happen? Why does it happen to me? Why does it happen to you? Why does it happen to them? And if we don't have answers to these questions, the easiest thing to do is not talk about it and to not show it. But if life is suffering, and to live is to have to suffer, that's what Buddhism teaches us. That doesn't make suffering good all by itself, right? But the fact that we can suffer, that we do suffer, that suffering is fundamentally human, and that is something that everyone experiences regardless of if you have $44 billion to buy Twitter, you're still clearly suffering just as much as little old me. I think that is a good thing. That universal ability to feel, to struggle, to feel sad, to cry, to question, to wonder, that's engaging with our reality in the world. That's engaging with the deepest, most important questions we can ask. And that's a deep theological truth. We talk about the interconnectedness and the interdependence of all of us. And at some level, all of us has felt the same things. Not in the same ways, not in the same moments, but there's a universal understanding there. You know who doesn't suffer? Sociopaths and robots. And sociopaths suffer without knowing that they are suffering. That's what makes it hard and potentially dangerous. Robots have it easy. Robots don't suffer. They don't feel pain. They don't cry unless they're programmed to, but then it's not real. But apart from a very few Hollywood movies, robots also don't love. They don't feel joy. They don't experience grace. They don't feel community. And no amount of Silicon Valley apps or self-driving cars or drone delivery of baby milk to my front door can teach me how to love or how to feel. And a robot can never understand what someone goes through if they lose their parents, if they lose their best friend, if they lose a job, if they lose a relationship. You can't build an app that replicates loss. You can't give a TED Talk that accurately describes what it is to feel joy. You can't synthesize heartbreak or fabricate faith or replicate anger. Only we do that. With our imperfect, suffering bodies that cry and apologize and yell and love and get in fights and have conflicts and silly arguments and live and die. To live is to suffer. To paraphrase my granddad, ain't that some stuff? So in our tradition, I would never tell anyone that you're suffering for a purpose. This pain has a reason. That everything happens for a reason, because I don't believe that. Suffering is awful a lot of the time. And yet it is a part of who we are as a people. It's a part of what it is to be human. And it is a part of what makes us a community. Because why would you need community if you didn't suffer? So I don't want to give up on something that makes me fundamentally human, because the other reality from our Buddhist tradition is that we help make our life what it is. That everything that we are is from our mind. It's not just the reflection of what happens to us, it's how we receive it, how we respond to it. And through making meaning, if we can, that is also what makes us human. But that is something that you practice. And sometimes that is a privilege, to make meaning out of suffering. And not all of us have the experience of being able to go to more weddings than funerals, to have joy alongside of sadness. Not all of us have the opportunity to experience the sunshiny days and to feel grateful for that when everything else feels like rain. And I hear that. And that makes me feel gratitude for when I do have the good things. for when I do feel sunshine and joy and love and community. And that helps me, sitting on the bus, to recognize, suffering is a part of life. And rather than try to fight that, I can let that go and let that be. To notice it in Buddhist language when it arises, recognize it, name it, and say, suffering, my old friend. And then let it go. Try and get its release off of me. Because I'm human and I know what it means to suffer. And because I know what it means to suffer, I also know what it means to love. Because I know what it means to be sad, I also know really what it means to feel joy. And if I'm ever trying to cut any of that off, to not feel, to not suffer, to not talk about it, if I'm ever taking any of that is a part of life, is a part of me, then I'm cutting off part of myself, right? It's like cutting off a hand or a finger or whatever body part you need, your ear, your eye. And you're not whole anymore. That wholeness implies some suffering. Because to be fully human and fully whole means you got a little bit of everything. That we're not robots who, despite their sleek design and the fact that my iPhone has no screws that you can see, it's very pleasant looking and it does all the things I need it to do, it does not love me. And it never will. The cyclical nature of life and suffering from our Buddhist siblings helps me understand that whenever there's suffering or conflict, whenever I get into a fight with my partner, or I feel tension in a room, there's been some kind of racial misunderstanding between me and my friends, I feel that tension, I feel that suffering. And if I can learn to recognize that, respond in a way that allows me to let it go and to learn from it, I'm starting that cycle back. And the cycle back from suffering, I like to think, brings us back to our center. That a way to think of this is that you have like your center, whatever that is. It might be theological, so your ground might you call God. Your center might be this community. It might be your family. It might be the idea that fundamentally I'm good and I can do this, that I'm worthy of joy. That if that is your center, then suffering or conflict or pain kind of pull you away from that and you can start to lose yourself. And if you can find a way to notice and let it go and come back to your center, there you are. Here you are. But life is suffering. So unfortunately, we don't get to stay in that center forever. It's not a one and done situation. Something else will happen and we'll come down and then we'll come back. Because suffering is cyclical. And so is love. And so is joy. And so is community. And so is that process of returning to what we might call our covenant, our ground with one another. That says, hey, I'm here for you. I know what you're going through. I may not know exactly how you feel, but I suffer too. Come on back to this center. Come on back to this ground. Because to know what it is to suffer is to know what it is to live. And that is a message for everyone. For everyone. For every beloved human being searching for love at our center. So friends, in the midst of our suffering, big or small, deep or shallow, acute or chronic, know that there is a spiral of humanity as well. A balance and attention and a practice of coming back to the center that for me is very hard to do, especially through meditation. I am not good at sitting still. I am not good at letting go of things. But I'm practicing. And I use my tradition, and I use my stuff, and I'm able to come back to the ground. So friends, in this spiral of humanity, in times of joy and sorrow, may we find spaces to breathe. If that's all you can do in the moment, may we find ways to notice. If that's all you can do, may we find ways to let go. And may we find ways to come back to our center. And may we find ways to share that journey with one another. Because that's what it is to be a community. To share our human story and to find wholeness and peace. May that be so. Amen. Once more, I'm going to invite us into some silence to reflect on those words, to name your suffering and maybe let it go. And I invite you to share any breakthroughs you have, especially with me afterwards, because God knows I need it. Friends, let's be holy and still in our silence in this space.